I'm going to present kind of an extract fragment from a piece of work that I've got ongoing about, alarmingly, dealing with some of my deepest fears, falling down mine shafts in modern Cornwall. It's a piece where, or this fragment, this element is a piece where I try and engage as a historian with a literary text, or at least a popular literary text. If it gets too painful for you, by all means do go and make a cup of tea. But I would be interested, one of the things I think I want to get out of this at least is to get some sense from experts in literary studies of whether or not I'm even doing this right. So I'd be interested to hear what you think about that. I'm going to talk about this short story. In January 1955, the Birmingham Weekly Post published a short story by Welsh author Dennis Val Baker, simply entitled The Mineshaft. Baker's story is what I describe as a fearsomely misogynistic account of murder gone wrong. The story tells of Cornishman John Cargeeg and his rather unhealthy designs on his uncle's former farm, which has been left on death to Cargeeg's cousin Beth. John and Beth, unaccountably, marry, but Beth, as it turns out, is not only a woman of property, but also a woman with a will of her own. Within hours of marriage, Cargeeg is dismissed by Beth to, as Baker puts it, go and see to the cows. As he adds, it was like that always, as if the woman were determined to prove herself the boss of the man. No woman should imagine she could get away with that. And actually, if you look at the extra I got here, this actually forms like surtitle to this short story in the printed form. Within the story, this comment frames a moment of transition in the plot as Cargeeg's motivation or legitimation in his mind for murder shifts from property to pride. Although Baker's narrator points out that as part of his plan to inherit Beth's estate, in quotation, it really would have made no difference, for John Cargeeg had known from the beginning that he would have to get rid of Beth. Nonetheless, at some point, this plotting device became, presumably through the intervention of an editor, a surtitle to the published story, framing the story as an invitation to a male reader to imagine violent retribution against his own emasculation. The presumed sympathy and satisfaction of a male reader is subsequently captured by the spectacular violence meted out to a woman who, through both personal fortune and personality, psychologically and fatally for her, humiliates her husband's masculinity. Reading The Mineshaft today, it's hard not to come away with the feeling that it's really a remarkably nasty piece of storytelling, albeit one that throws disturbing light on the nature of masculine anxieties in post-war Britain. It is, however, Cargeeg's means for the murder that he ultimately commits that I wish to focus on here. Baker's narrator tells the reader that, quote, for most of his life, Cargeeg had lived in a small hamlet in Cornwall. This isn't precisely mapped, interestingly, so I've made some inferences about what this means. In the heart of the old tin mining area. Ever since he could remember, he'd been surrounded by the gaunt silhouettes, effigies, you might almost call them, of dead tin mines, scarred relics of what had once been prosperous businesses. It's Cornwall's post-industrial, post-extractive landscape then that provides the specific territory on which Cargeeg's ultimately self-destructive desires will play out. Specifically, it's the punctured surfaces of Cornwall's long-dead industrial history that provide Cargeeg with his opportunity. And I'll move to the next slide here. As a boy, Baker writes, Cargeeg had played about on the moors and, like his playmates, had sometimes daringly approached the edge of one of these, talking about the mine shafts now, these fearsome yawning mine shafts, had, like others, taken a stone in one hand and thrown it over the edge and listened in vain for the sound of it striking the bottom. He's listening for something, it's quite interesting. It was then that John Cargeeg, coming back into the present, it was then that John Cargeeg remembered the mines, the day when he first made up his mind that he could stand Beth and her taunts no longer. He remembered the yawning black mouth of the mine shaft and throwing the stones over as a boy. and the long silence. The silence will come back to haunt Cargigue. Cargigue's sudden remembering of these shafts, these abandoned mines, is particularly curious. For how on earth could he have forgotten the shafts? After all, it quickly becomes apparent in the story that the landscape around the farm is dotted with these yawning black mouths, as they're called at another point. And yet we are asked to believe that they are barely in Cargigue's awareness, except at the moment he decides upon murder, somewhere on the fringes of the same land he's hoping to possess. They would be and were, in reality, an ever-present danger. Yet for Cargigue, the mine shaft is a remembrance of childhood. It's a site of memory, of untroubled homosocial freedom, of boyhood risk-taking, a contrast to the steady, patient deviousness that characterizes Cargigue's adult self. Ultimately, in the course of the story, Cargigue persuades Beth to accompany him on an inspection of her property. He tempts her to look into the eponymous mine shaft in search of a sheep that has got lost, presumed lost down the shaft. As Beth steps forward, Cargigue stabs her in the back and watches as her body is swallowed up in the shaft, just like, quotes, just like one of those stones thrown years ago by careless children. He then comments, interestingly, or the narrator does, he knew there was nothing to fear. No one could have seen him. No one would find the body. Why should they trouble to go down perhaps 40 or 50 mine shafts on the off chance? He'd tell the same story about Beth's peculiar behavior, how she'd walked out of the house saying she was going away. It is, however, in this very moment of apparent triumph that things go awry for Cargigue. The mine, his senses, his own adult cautiousness suddenly turn upon him. Worried that he had not heard the final end of his wife's body as it hit the bottom of the mine, Cargigue is drawn to the edge of the shaft to look down. As he did so, without warning, this is quoting again, the ground under his feet crumbled and shivered, I love the use of that word, shivered and fell away. Grasping desperately at thin air, Cargigue is swallowed by the ground, or lack of it, beneath him. Although his fall is broken by a tree stump to which Cargigue now desperately clings, he's left suspended mid-fall, simultaneously unable and unwilling to complete the descent, and unable to escape the shaft without aid. Cargigue thus endures the exquisite psychological torture of the fear of falling, the moment between possible death or maybe worse, possible mortally wounded life. Baker's narrator ultimately resolves this moment, telling us that sooner or later he would join his wife in oblivion, though, he underlines, without the benefit of the swift end he had ensured her. Even in death, then, Beth taunts Cargigue. Val Baker's story offers a fascinating insight, I think, into the reimagining of Cornwall's post-industrial landscape and the lingering dangers of the abandoned shaft. By 1955, when the story is written, nearly a century had passed since the heyday of the Cornish copper and tin industry, when Cornish mine workers, men, women, and children, had carved out thousands of such shafts throughout the Duchy. This moment at the frontier of extractive capitalism was relatively brief. By the 1860s, copper extraction was in rapid decline in the face of global competition from imperial deposits elsewhere. The remaining tin industry would endure a long, slow decay until the last Cornish tin mine, South Crofty, shut its gates in 1998. Yet as Baker's story reveals, while mining as an industry might be all but gone, the physical and psychological presence of the mines remained. In addition to the scarred relics and effigies of the Cornish engine house, so familiar in the romanticized image making of modern Cornwall, Central and West Cornwall was haunted by the invisible dangers of many hundreds of unmarked shafts scattered uncertainly across private property in a county rapidly transforming from industrial frontier to tourist destination. As landscape use and representations changed, so the dangerous legacy of the industrial frontier changed also. From a navigable everyday hazard to an almost imperceptible yet ever-present threat. The Mineshaft, as a short story then, presents us with exactly this tension. The shaft and its dangers are familiar to both Cargigue and his wife. Scattered across Beth's farm are 40 or 50 such openings, we're told, too many supposedly to search. They are known but unaccountable danger, simultaneously ever present and absent, obvious and opaque. It's interesting to speculate how Baker himself first encountered the perils of the abandoned shaft. Baker, a Welshman, had come to Cornwall after the Second World War and joined the artistic community that built itself around the modernist artistic movement in St Ives. He lived for some time around the area of Trencrom Hill at the Landowners, just south of Carbis Bay. The surrounding parishes of Hallstown, Tywednac and Cripplesea have been subject to heavy mining in the early 19th century. And even in Victorian times, when these dangers would have been much more apparent, the concentration of shafts regularly snared the unwary or the unfortunate. For instance, one winter's night in January 1858, John Berryman was walking home from a presumably pleasant evening at the Engine Inn to his home at the parish of Tywednac near St Ives. In the deepening dark, he missed the path he was supposed to be following through the old Reeth Consols mine. Unaware of the danger, Berryman lumbered over the edge of an old shaft and fell 16 fathoms, about 96 feet. Berryman survived this descent, but like Cargigue, he remained stuck for 3 days in what the West Briton newspaper laconically described as that distressing situation, having tried to alert someone to his situation till his strength was exhausted and his voice failed. Eventually, though, unlike Cargigue, and through pure good fortune, Berryman was rescued by a person throwing a small stone in the shaft, which attracted his notice. These dangers were mirrored across several other intense concentrations of shafts across the Duchy, perhaps most notably at St Day in Cornwall. This was a landscape dotted with innumerable holes following the lines of the adits or levels below. There were so many that until relatively recently, someone leaving any of the well-worn paths in the district would be taking a serious gamble with their life. In fact, to the present day, and despite a long-running and controversial project of capping these shafts, there's still plenty of unprotected shafts to be found on private land, the secret knowledge of explorers increasingly cut off from the maze of levels below. Occasionally, a long-forgotten shaft obscured by the work of soldering over, the name given to capping in Victorian times, a shaft, over a mine that had closed, will unexpectedly swallow a garden. And as in 2016, when what was thought to be an 18th century shaft suddenly opened in Scoria near Camborne. Across wide parts of the Duchy, then, a pedestrian still cannot wholly trust the solidity of the ground beneath their feet and has to tread lightly. The dangers out to which Baker's short story were compiled were, however, a part of wider Cornish landscape law. And I think this is the kind of key point I want to point to here. Stories of falls and near misses are so plentiful in both print and oral narrative that they almost naturally begin to form part of a larger narrative. Certainly the archives reveal many accounts that bear eerie resemblance to Cargigue's own fate. Take the example of a farmer named Bert, for example, who met with a singular death in 1877 while trying to dispose of a dead sheep down an old mine, but was ultimately undone when, and this is how the newspaper puts it, the cord by which the carcass had been dragged to the spot, having twisted round his leg when he threw in the sheep, he was also dragged down the shaft and fell 200 feet perpendicularly. Cargigue's experience as a child playing dangerously at the shaft's edge, for example, is similarly mirrored in story after story of children lost playing on the burrows, the Cornish name given to these old mining sites. In 1937, 6-year-old Audrey Gilbert fell into an abandoned shaft at the old V mine in Camborne while playing with friends. The incident inspired a great deal of coverage in local newspapers, but was in fact merely one of many such incidents running back into the 19th century. And in fact, his body was never recovered. There are other ways in which Baker's story also reflects this popular history of the dangers of the disused shaft. Beth's concern for her lost sheep, for example, mirrors the innumerable reports of rescues of lost pets and farm animals that had fallen into these shafts. Remarkable acts of animal rescue formed what was almost a minor industry in mid-20th century Cornwall, with retired miners often taking advantage of the chance to show off their knowledge and skills. Some individuals were responsible for rescuing literally dozens of animals from abandoned shafts. A very nice instance of this genre is the account of Mrs. Nelson, a young widow who was lowered 80 feet into a mine at Jermo in 1939 to rescue her dog, and who, after succeeding, was drawn, as the newspaper put it, drawn to the surface exhausted. Her courage earned her a silver medal from the RSPCA. The same month, Charles Phillips was involved in his 39th rescue of a dog near Relubus. There are also uncanny stories of people disappearing from their homes in mining districts, never to return home, lost to one of the so many holes in the ground that it would be impossible to search them, in Cargeek's thoughts. Just 4 years after Baker's short story was published, in fact, Clara Parks of Upton Cross in Carradon went missing in a disappearance reported as most mysterious. Newspapers lying untouched at the front door were the first clue to her absence, and inside the cottage, everything was as if Miss Parks had stepped outside only for an instant. Despite searches of a district that was described as honeycombed with dangerous disused tin mine shafts, no trace was ever found of Mrs. Parks, and searches had to be abandoned because of dangerous weather conditions. There are even stories that can be identified in which the abandoned shaft is itself used as a means for murder. Perhaps one of the most tragic being the story of Ethel Physick in 1909, who was actually found guilty of murdering her illegitimate daughter by throwing her down a shaft at Wheal St Aubin near Gwenup. What does any of this tell us about the nature of the abandoned mine shaft, or for that matter, Cornwall's literary landscape? And my perhaps disappointing short answer for now is that I'm really not sure. This paper has only touched upon one example, really, of the synthesis of popular law of the abandoned shaft and its transformation into a rather troubling cultural landscape artifact. For the moment, I want to, however, return to the misogynistic fantasizing that I implied was at the center of Baker's story, his reimagining of this dangerous landscape. Despite the perhaps rather lazy moralizing motif of a criminal undone by the means of his own crime, a contemporary reader today cannot but be struck by Baker's use of the disused mine shaft as a place for the examination of masculine anxiety. This relic of past industrial masculinity and entrepreneurialism, long since defunct, still haunts those no longer able to profit from its working. It's a permanent reminder of industrial prosperity and its human price. It's also, in Baker's telling, a repressed presence in a landscape scarred by extractive capitalism. Perhaps then the mineshaft story works so effectively because it brings back to life a dead infrastructure, making the mineshaft live again as part of a violent masculine fantasy of wealth and personal autonomy. In real life, though, this zombie presence had very real victims. Innumerable lost children and animals attest to the enduring slow violence of post-extractive ruination long after the mines had gone. Read from this perspective then, Baker's short story is, I think, or can be read as, an account of zombie capitalism, dead labor that lives on to trouble the presence with its own somehow unaccountable capacity for action and harm. Cargeek thinks that the mine shaft is a tool he can bend to his own designs, yet he underestimates how the ground beneath him lives on still. For a moment, at the end of the story, Cargeek and Baker are perhaps both conscious of this uncanny afterlife of the mine as it returns to life and swallows Cargeek whole.